It all began with a heavy snowfall that lasted for several days without stopping. People were not prepared for this, so things became very difficult for them. To survive, they had to find a place that was warmer. So they kept moving toward their goal all day long, holding their weapons, because the snow wasn't the only danger. Suddenly, on their path, they saw the remains of a crashed airplane. Moreover, near a tree, they saw a person who had taken his own life and hanged himself, unable to withstand such hardships. Suddenly, they heard knocking from beneath the snow. This didn't stop them. They decided to head toward the crashed plane or at least find some supplies. When they got closer, they noticed something alive there, and it was moving. Once there, they realized that the man who had hanged himself wasn't dead at all. He growled and acted very strangely. Someone began crawling out from under the snow. It was a creature unlike a human. Its face was deformed and blackened from the freezing cold. The men could not believe their eyes. They couldn't understand how this had ever been a person. They immediately noticed his military uniform, and they realized that in front of them stood an experienced general who had now turned into a growling zombie. The man with glasses wanted to deal with him and kill him, so he rushed into attack armed with only a knife. He ran forward, preventing his comrade from wasting precious bullets. He was going to stab the creature to finish off the horrifying monster standing before them. He started stabbing the zombie in the head. After a while, the zombie stopped growling. It seemed dead. The men began carefully searching the camp, trying to find anything valuable, and hoping to hear the last autopilot signal. Perhaps the pilots had tried to leave some kind of message before performing the emergency landing. Suddenly, the protagonist heard another strange noise and realized that an enemy was right behind him. He turned around and saw the horrifying zombie hanging from the rope, ready to leap at him. But the rope was too short and it couldn't reach him. The man wanted to look at its ID and find out who the soldier had been before turning, but the zombie wouldn't let him, so he pressed his weapon to its head, preparing to fire. He pulled the trigger. A shot rang out, and the bullet pierced straight through its head. Pieces of skull and blood flew everywhere, and he had to shield his face with his arm. The mutant was finished. It was dead. Another man approached him, having heard the gunshot. He asked if everything was okay and whether he was hurt. They managed to find some documents and were happy. They seemed very important. Without wasting time, they began examining them carefully. Another device also caught his attention. It looked like a phone, but it might have actually been a radio emitting strange sounds. He learned that a command bunker had been prepared in case of disaster, and that survivors could be hiding there. And that device, which resembled a radio, might actually be a key. With this key, they had a chance to get inside the bunker and survive the apocalypse. So after putting the key in his pocket, he decided to head toward the bunker and try to reach the capital. The journey would be long, and in the best case, he hoped to reach it in 10 days. Suddenly, some noise drew their attention. The snow began to move. The sergeant ordered his private to step back and stay behind him. He said they needed to hurry, but it was already too late. The avalanche began, and both of them were buried and started falling down. It felt as if the ground had collapsed under them, and the sergeant fell into a deep ravine. His assistant remained above and tried shouting down to him. But the sergeant had hit his head, and for a while couldn't understand what had happened. Eventually, he regained consciousness, and then heard another strange sound. Among the debris, he saw metal wreckage, and a hand that might have belonged to a person. He couldn't believe his eyes. Could this be another zombie? The sergeant watched closely and saw the hand start to move. He understood he had to act quickly and jumped away from the dangerous creature. He held his weapon tightly, ready to shoot at any second. He knew he couldn't waste bullets and prayed the zombie wouldn't crawl out. It turned out to be a car, and the people inside had turned into mutants and were now trying to escape. And there were many of them. They began growling, and he could see how all of them together tried to push their way out. Suddenly, the door swung open, and the first thing he saw was the bloody smile of the mutants. Now he was in real trouble. The creatures had managed to escape and were ready to attack him. It was a woman with her child, both turned into zombies. It became clear that the horrific virus spared no one. Even children could become mutants. Their faces were horrifying and twisted, with nothing left that resembled humans. His hands began to tremble. Even though he was a soldier, he was terrified and couldn't even reload his weapon. There was very little time left. The mutants were approaching. He kept them in his sights, ready to shoot at any moment. He didn't want to do this, but he understood he had no other choice. It was hard for him to kill the mutants. He believed there might be a cure to turn them back into normal people. So each kill was extremely painful for him. He felt as if he was killing living humans. One bullet wasn't enough to stop them. He had to shoot many times, aiming straight at the head to conserve the few bullets he had left. He managed to stop the woman, but the child got close to him. The zombie child jumped right at him. The man had to defend himself. He didn't have time to shoot. So that the monster wouldn't bite him, he shielded himself with his weapon. The small zombie was so strong it pushed him back with its weight. The man kept resisting, realizing that at this rate his weapon would soon break. The creature's teeth cracked against the metal, sending sparks flying, but it didn't stop. It kept pushing, relentless, while the man begged it to stop and step back, not wanting to fight it. His strength was fading, and the monster's teeth snapped dangerously close to his face. He was terrified and began screaming. But gathering his last strength, he shoved the creature away. The monster flew backward and hit the ground. That saved his life. Now he had a moment to prepare for the next attack. But that didn't stop the creature. Within seconds, it got up again and tried to attack him a second time. But this time, he managed to aim and kept it at gunpoint. Now, he no longer saved bullets. He knew his life depended on this. The man shot straight into its head repeatedly, but even that didn't kill it immediately. Its eyes and part of its face were shattered from the bullets. He kept firing without stopping. He screamed in fear, knowing he might die right now. And the sergeant, who watched everything happening, didn't know how he could help his comrade. He was terrified and realized he wouldn't reach him in time. Besides that, the man ordered him not to come any closer. He understood that if he did, both of them would die. The monster was only a few centimeters away from him. The barrel of his rifle pierced the mutant's head. To stop it, he spent almost an entire magazine. And only then, under the massive barrage of bullets, its head finally exploded into pieces. It seemed he had finally managed to fight back and stop that deadly attack. Because of it, the man was breathing heavily, and for a while couldn't calm down or collect himself. He looked at that mass of mutants and couldn't believe such a terrifying virus existed and could do this to anyone. After all, they had all once been human, and no one had been safe from the infection. The private tried shouting to him, not knowing what to do. John gave him another order, telling him to stay where he was and be ready for anything. He understood that something unpredictable could happen at any moment, but he needed to climb back up. There were also a lot of documents lying on the ground, and he began picking them up, hoping there was something valuable in them. But suddenly he heard a crunch beneath his feet. He realized he was standing on ice, and beneath it was a huge body of water. Brushing away the snow, he saw a deep lake, at the bottom of which there had once been a huge city. Inside it were buildings and countless people who had ended up beneath the ice and turned into mutants. Some of them were still alive, because even underwater zombies couldn't be killed so easily. The private obeyed his order and began climbing down to the sergeant. When he reached him, he saw the man had gone pale and was clearly terrified of something. He wanted to help, but suddenly fell through the snow and got trapped. His behavior angered the sergeant, who had told him not to move and to stay where he was. He managed to free himself from the snowdrift and explained that he had only been afraid for the sergeant's life and wanted to help. They had to be careful, because beneath them was a huge, deep body of water, and at any moment the ice could crack. The situation was very dangerous, so they needed to leave that place as quickly as possible and move farther away. But suddenly he saw that the man was being attacked. There were zombies under the snow that had broken free because of the landslide. And at that very moment, they attacked Chanu. Poor Chanu didn't even have time to react or escape. He was in mortal danger. Right before the sergeant's eyes, the zombies began tearing him to pieces, and it became clear he was doomed. The sergeant's hands started to tremble. He wanted to shoot, but he had no bullets left. He had spent everything he had. Chanu begged him to fire and kill him so that he wouldn't turn into a mutant as well. He screamed in agony as the mutants surrounded him and ripped his body apart. But the sergeant couldn't do it. His eyes were full of tears as he silently watched his friend die. Yet he couldn't let him go in such a horrible way. So he fired, ending his suffering. The mutants started devouring the body, and using that moment, the sergeant ran, trying to save his own life. But escaping was not easy at all. He had to climb a steep slope. It took incredible effort just to get out. The sergeant fought with everything he had to climb up, but the snow kept sliding under his feet and he clutched at the roots. Suddenly, the snow collapsed under him again, but he managed to grab onto the roots with his hands and avoided certain death. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. He wasn't supposed to be like this, and because of him, his comrade had died. He was deeply disappointed in himself, feeling guilty for his friend's death and for not being able to save him. But he understood he couldn't waste time. He had to keep moving forward in search of the bunker. He tried to encourage himself, reminding himself that he was Cheon Yonhun and wasn't the kind of man who gave up in the face of hardship. So, gathering his things and getting ready, he set off again. He walked very quickly, knowing he had to get away from there as fast as possible. To do that, he even threw away part of his gear that was too heavy and slowed him down. He planned to cover a long distance in a much shorter time. Besides, he was close to the lake and understood there were many mutants under the snow. A lot of years passed after that. Almost nothing changed in his life. He still wandered the world, searching for survivors. At last, he again reached the outskirts of some city where he hoped to find living people. Once there had been a huge city here, full of life, but now there was nothing left. The only thing that remained was a bunker beneath the tallest building, where the survivors had built themselves a shelter. Cheon Yonhun couldn't understand how they had managed to survive in such brutal conditions. But he knew for sure that these people were truly lucky. Fortune had smiled on them. One of the women said they survived thanks to an apiary they had. The bees provided them with precious honey. But before the apocalypse began, she had noticed the bees going mad and seemingly attacking and killing each other. At that moment, the entire swarm started fighting, and thousands of insects died right before their eyes. They watched what was happening and thought it was some kind of curse. And then they noticed the sky growing dark with black clouds. From that day on, the worst thing they had ever seen in their lives began. Huge rocks started falling from the sky. There were many of them. They had no time to pack or even think. The man grabbed her by the hand and dragged her away to save her. A massive earthquake began. Realizing they had no time to escape, people lay down on the ground. The earth shook beneath them, and knowing they could die at any moment, they simply hugged each other and started praying. They recalled every prayer and every god they had ever known or heard of in their lives. Suddenly, her story was interrupted by a strange man who seemed not to have been listening at all. The coffee was ready, and he offered them a cup. But coffee was extremely rare, and they only drank it on special occasions. He just laughed when he saw her husband's reaction and offered them another cup. Before taking a sip, they smelled it carefully, because they hadn't tasted coffee in many years. The man kept smiling, believing that anyone who truly wanted to survive would find a way. He said they were in what had once been a large tourist city, and even now, many survivors still came through here. He tried to trade with them, and that was how he managed to survive and get such valuable goods. Now he was gathering a new batch of items, knowing that merchants would soon be coming to their city again. The woman looked at him in surprise, not believing he could be that clever and resourceful. She thought that if he was such a successful trader, then he probably needed helping hands, and she used to know how to sew. She offered him her help, but her words made her own husband jealous. He clearly didn't trust the man, thinking he was only trying to charm them and distract them from something worse. On top of that, the stranger kept watching her and constantly smiling. There was nothing kind in that smile, and it frightened the husband and drew his attention. He turned away, but he had already noticed something odd in that smile, as if he had seen it somewhere before. The stranger smiled again and said he often heard the same words from strangers he met. And now that they had started talking about it, he was going to show them his greatest pride, the work of his entire life. He admitted that he was actually a producer and made truly incredible things. At that moment, he invited them to follow him so they could see everything with their own eyes. But he took only the husband with him, telling the woman to stay in the room and rest. Then he led the man down into a dark, unlit basement that was cold and damp. To see at least something, he turned on a flashlight and shone it on the stairs. He again assured him he meant no harm and truly wanted to help. The man started to believe him and even promised to repay his kindness. By then, he was convinced the stranger really might be making something unusual and valuable. After all, he kept it deep underground and didn't tell anyone about it at first. He said that traders were willing to pay a real fortune for just one of these items. When he stepped inside, he couldn't believe his own eyes. His eyes widened and he froze. He had never seen anything like this. The basement was full of pigs, live pigs, which the man called his material. Then he showed him the items on the table. There were many of them, already packed into special boxes. The visitor still couldn't believe what he was seeing. In front of him was real food, the very thing the world lacked the most, and there was a lot of it. In his small factory, the man produced canned pork. He even had a special meat grinder and lots of other equipment for it. The businessman explained that these weren't ordinary canned goods. He made them only from the best cuts of meat. The guest couldn't believe it and rushed to the table. He hadn't eaten anything truly tasty since the beginning of the apocalypse. Their host went on about how, because of the zombies, it was extremely difficult to find fresh meat, and as he spoke, he pulled on a pair of gloves. He approached his workbench, which was covered with all kinds of tools, knives, saws, and hammers. He kept talking to him while putting on a special suit. Then he carefully looked over his tools and began choosing the one that suited him best. His guest was so distracted by the canned food that he didn't even notice he'd walked right into a trap. He tried to ask for at least a small piece because he really wanted to taste that food and to share it with his wife. But when he turned around, he couldn't believe his eyes. Now he understood where he was, but it was already too late. Could he really be planning to kill him? Were all those pigs and cans just a cover-up for the crimes happening in this basement? He began backing away, realizing what was about to happen to him. He saw the hammer in the man's hand and guessed what those canned goods were really made of. Just like before, the man kept smiling, but now his smile had changed again. At that moment, he began explaining his recipe and admitted that he used only 20% pork meat. And the other 80%, he didn't finish the sentence, but the man understood everything without words. Right then, he felt something slam hard into his stomach. The blow was so strong and unexpected that he could barely stay on his feet and almost fainted. When he turned around, he saw a huge number of human bodies hanging from hooks, and suddenly he remembered that familiar look and that smile. Now it all made sense. He was struck again, and blood splattered onto the floor. The pigs started squealing in terror, and blood appeared on the butcher's face, blood that belonged to the guest he had just attacked. The man was still alive, lying on the ground and wheezing, with blood running from the wound on his head. At that moment, the butcher began laughing and called out to his mistress. She didn't respond, so he shouted even louder. Only after a while did she answer, and she slowly began descending into the basement. After that, all that remained in the basement was a long trail of blood. The butcher dragged the man across the floor straight to his table. Now he began preparing to turn him into canned food, slicing his body into pieces. He drained the blood into a bucket because even that was valuable and used in his production. This happened to everyone he met on his path. He tried to kill each one and lure them into his basement, and he was thrilled that he had another opportunity this time. After killing the man, he went after the wife, forcing her to go down to the basement as well. He stood in front of her and right before her eyes, cut her husband's body into pieces, sorting the meat by category. He kept her alive on purpose, forcing her to watch everything. He hung her on a hook, and she was still conscious. She talked to him, calling him a monster, but that only entertained him even more. He mocked her, saying he was just a normal person, and that he wasn't any different from others. He just tried to survive. He began threatening her, saying she would suffer horrible pain before she died. Leaving her hanging, he removed his gloves and headed upstairs. Now he had a fresh new batch of meat, and he was getting ready to turn it into product. When he climbed out of the basement, he heard someone calling him. A man introduced himself as a butcher shop supplier. The caller told him about a new order and a new buyer. Soon he would receive batteries and other valuable items he had requested. This made him very happy. This time obtaining the product had been extremely difficult, but he managed, and he got what he wanted. Besides, his boss's birthday was in a few days, so he needed to prepare well. But he got angry when he heard about the birthday. Their calendar had disappeared years ago, and now they had no notes and didn't even know what day it was anymore. Suddenly, he heard that strange sound again, something that immediately caught his attention. It made him stop talking and put down the phone. He was surprised. He had never heard anything like that before. He replied that the buyers could pick up a fresh batch of meat tomorrow, which he planned to prepare tonight. He began talking about the people his accomplices had captured and sent to him to be turned into food. As it turned out, those people were his partners. They regularly sent him new victims to process. So he warned them to send only one next time. It would make things much easier for him. He grew angry. His accomplices had tasted power and now behaved arrogantly, forcing him to do all the dirty work. But in reality, they were the same kind of criminals he was. The only difference was that they didn't chop people into pieces. He shouted into the phone, furious. He threatened to go to their leader and set things right, and punish all his buddies who thought they were so tough. He kept yelling, calling them pathetic losers who would have been nothing without him. He threatened to turn them into minced meat himself if they didn't stop acting so arrogantly. He didn't want to follow their orders or obey them. Finally, he snapped. Rage shook his hands and his whole body. He slammed the phone down and took deep breaths, trying to calm himself and regain control. All this time, his colleagues had been listening and heard everything that had happened. Then he abruptly ended the call. That was the end of the message, and hung up. He was still furious and couldn't believe those scum dared to order him around or even try to command him. So he planned to visit their camp someday and punish them for disrespecting him. But for now, he smiled again and tried to think of something pleasant, remembering the woman waiting for him in the basement. So tonight he planned to go to bed early to rest and recover properly. Snow was falling outside and he was heading toward his bedroom. But the entire time, he was being watched. Someone had him in their sights. It was the sergeant. He had seen a light in the man's window. Using a special device, he measured the distance to the house and checked that nothing blocked the path. He observed very carefully, making sure no other enemies in the city spotted him or went searching for him at that moment. Finally, after many years of searching, he found this city, Suel, the city everyone talked about. And he knew this city belonged to a single man, the one who had fully privatized it. The sergeant hoped this man would be good, not another cruel murderer. So before approaching the house, he decided to observe him for a few days, to understand who he really was and whether the place was safe. And if everything seemed safe, then he would go to him and try to negotiate. He began climbing down and planned to find a safe place to spend the night. His backpack was nearby. He had left it below to make climbing easier. Now he prepared to move on. In front of him was a huge ship that had once sunk and was now nothing but ruins. He went inside. It was the perfect place to hide for the night. There was no light, and outside it was pitch black, so he had to use his flashlight. He explored the ship. It was his first time there. The structure was strange, full of very large windows, and he knew that if even a tiny beam of light escaped outside, he'd be in big trouble. Ahead he saw a sign. It looked like a men's restroom. There was no doubt. That's exactly what it was. He knew that restrooms usually didn't have windows, so this was the safest spot he could find. Before entering, he examined the area carefully. The restroom was higher up, so to avoid dropping his flashlight, he held it in his teeth while climbing. To reach it, he had to climb several levels. So he began climbing upward. When he reached it, he left some of his gear behind. It was too heavy. Then he climbed even higher, heading to the farthest stall. Only there could he be sure it was truly safe and that no one would notice him. Anyone trying to get up here would have to cover a long distance first. Now he checked the soundproofing and whether the metal might break off. So he carefully tapped on it to check whether the structure, after so many years, was still solid. At first glance, everything seemed fine, but suddenly one of the metal plates came off. That was exactly what he'd expected to see, and it seemed to be part of his plan. Cheon Yun-hun wanted to secure a safe escape route in case the enemies found him and he had to retreat. The next day, many mutants crawled out of the snow and started moving toward the city. One of them was a woman who had once been a swimmer, judging by the special suit she wore. She wandered through the snowy wasteland and eventually reached the outskirts of the city. Sensing the smell and presence of humans, the zombie began to growl. They were extremely hungry, so they had traveled a long distance searching for the city and concentrations of people. But suddenly something chopped off her head. The head rolled down the slope while the zombie's body remained standing. Only when it reached the bottom did the head finally stop. After some time, living people appeared. They guarded the outskirts and killed any mutants that got close. They were real bandits, marked with special symbols identifying their gang. The men rode special snowmobiles that allowed them to cover long distances quickly. Instead of firearms, they carried simple swords, since bullets were incredibly rare, and you could swing a sword as much as you wanted. So swords became a very effective weapon in the fight against mutants. One of them wore a strange necklace made of headphones that had once belonged to living people. His machine was damaged, and behind him another comrade was being towed on a snowboard tied to a rope. They were having fun, and at one point, he tried to jump over a mutant, but he failed and ended up landing right on it. This time, he was far less lucky. His leg got caught on the creature's clothing. In that moment, he felt a sharp pain and screamed in fear. The boy fell, leaving a trail of blood on the snow. But this only amused the others, and they didn't treat it as anything serious. Suddenly, more people appeared behind them in a car, keeping up with them. In the back sat people they had captured, their prisoners. The women looked utterly devastated, knowing they no longer had any chance to escape. Like many others, they had come to the city hoping to find life and other survivors here. At that moment, the gang was heading toward the ship where the main character was hiding. This encounter would be a real shock for him. He didn't expect to see bandits there, but he anticipated their arrival and hid in the snow. They didn't even notice him and passed by. He now understood that without his escape plan, he would have been in serious danger. His observations paid off. He realized a very dangerous gang operated around this city. They kidnapped people and abused them, turning them into their prisoners. The city was no longer what it had once been. Nothing good remained here. And he began to understand just how much danger awaited him. Most likely, every living person here was now in danger. Right then, he was watching the hostile gang. They stopped at the very house he had been observing for many days. That was the place where they brought all their captives and left them. They made no exceptions for women or children. They dragged everyone there. The snowboarder's leg looked horrific. The wound was very serious. They hoped the old man who owned the house would help him, but he had other plans. He didn't want to waste time on him and said it would be easier just to cut off the leg, or kill him outright and turn him into mince. It was his problem, he said. No one would waste time helping him. He laughed and promised he'd kill him and cut off his head. To defend himself, the wounded boy pulled out a knife and started threatening him. There had been bad blood between them for a long time. They constantly fought for power. But as soon as he drew the knife, he realized he had walked into a deadly trap. The old man wasn't as simple as he looked. He moved first and pressed his own knife to the boy's throat. As an experienced killer, he was ready to strike at any moment if the boy so much as tried to attack. Without hesitation, he killed anyone who could pose a threat to him. He saw it as his duty. Only that way could he secure his own survival. The boy suddenly lost his confidence and decided to surrender, dropping the weapon. At that moment, the old man stepped closer and stared straight into his eyes. He told him he had only a few seconds left to live. Afterward, only his clothes and hair would remain. Just then, his friends dragged him away from the old man and warned him that it was dangerous to joke with him. They threw him to the ground and grew angry. They were only delivering goods and didn't need any problems. They apologized to the old man, explaining that the boy was a rookie and that this was his first job. But even after those words, the old man didn't calm down. He was already wiping his knife on his jacket, ready to deal with him. They tried to soothe him again, promising not to bring the newbie with them anymore so as not to anger him. They also quietly admitted that they thought the old man was insane. Then one of them stepped up to the rookie and struck him on the head with all his strength. After the blow, they shoved him, and the poor guy rolled down the hill. They joked that they'd make sure he'd never be allowed on raids again because of his health. But the old man wasn't about to let him go. He'd already set his sights on him and wanted to grind him into mince. Smiling, he looked him straight in the eyes and promised that sooner or later they would meet again. The boy came to a stop a few meters away and realized he might now be in serious trouble. At that moment, the old man turned his attention to the two captives who didn't dare say a word. He motioned to them with his hand, inviting them to come closer. He wanted to examine them carefully and invite them into his home. The men from the gang said they would come back for them the next day at the same time. But the old man refused. He asked them to leave one snowmobile so he could deliver the captives himself the next day. They couldn't do that. If they lost a vehicle, they'd be in huge trouble. In the end, the old man disappeared into his house together with his new guests. By that time, the rookie had already managed to get back on his feet. His behavior deeply annoyed the gang leader, so he walked up to him. He grabbed him by the face and started choking him. He was furious that the kid had dared open his mouth in front of such an influential man. If he ever did that again, he would immediately be demoted to a slave and lose his position. He hit him once more and ordered him to get up and follow. It was time to head back. A few minutes later, after collecting their things, they were ready to leave. Meanwhile, the old man stood in front of his captives, studying them from head to toe. The girls understood what these men were planning to do to them, so they lowered their eyes and didn't dare look up. Their fear made the man happy. It confirmed his power over them. He pointed at one of the girls and ordered her to come closer. Her name was Mijin. She began to tremble with fear, but she had no choice and stepped toward him. He ordered her to go up to the second floor to slice meat. Mijin became even more terrified when she heard this. She didn't want to be separated from her friend. She tried to say something to her, but he noticed, walked closer, and glared at them angrily. Then he smiled again, just as he always did, and tried to convince the girls that his house was safe and he wouldn't hurt them. He even handed her his knife and warned that if they spoiled his mood, they would be punished. He stared at the woman, trying to intimidate her, squeezing her hands as he passed her the knife. Her whole body started to shake. After that, he shoved her away and sent her back up to the second floor to cut meat. He added that he would be coming up to her very soon. Now his attention was drawn to the other girl, who was still standing in the middle of the room. She clung to the table and refused to let go, but he ordered her to come closer. She gripped the edge of the table even tighter, guessing what he wanted to do to her. She remembered the words of the people who had brought her to this house. They'd told her that under no circumstances should they resist. They advised them to do everything exactly as he ordered, to clear their minds and try not to think about anything. Because if anyone tried to resist, it only excited him even more, and he wouldn't calm down until he got what he wanted. And that's exactly what happened. He grabbed her hair with all his strength. Then he slammed her down onto the table and stood behind her. He leaned in close and told her that for an entire month he had smelled nothing but meat. But now everything was different once he caught the scent of a living person, and a pretty girl at that. He lifted his head and began to smile. He admitted that from the very moment he first saw her, he had wanted to kill her. Meanwhile, the courier's vehicle was already driving away from his place. The rookie couldn't accept being humiliated in front of everyone. He was outraged at the way they had treated him. He had always done everything he was told, and couldn't understand why they treated him like that. He also hated that the boss had hit him in front of the other slaves. He was afraid of what they might now think of him. He kept complaining when, suddenly, another punch to the face cut him off. The boss couldn't listen to him any longer and shut him up with another blow to the face. The punch broke his nose and blood started pouring out. The driver got angry that they were messing up his interior. He didn't want to scrub blood out of it later. He noticed the badges on the boss's jacket, awarded for exemplary service. So he figured the man thought he was stronger and smarter than everyone else, which is why he allowed himself to beat him. He started talking about Ju Yonak, saying he was a real bastard who had once been a professional police officer. On top of that, he had a terrible temper and didn't limit himself to catching only criminals. During his service, many innocent people suffered because of him, people who had done nothing to him. Eventually, because of his actions, he was arrested and suspended from duty for several years. He was a complete psychopath, so it was better not to provoke him or risk dealing with him at all. That's why they couldn't understand why they didn't just kill him instead of making deals and doing everything the way he wanted. In fact, he was one of 3 legendary psychopaths living on the outskirts of the city, a so-called zombie killer. They said Ju Yonak and the 2 other lunatics had already hunted down hundreds of thousands of zombies. Over time, the climate began to change and the snow slowly melted, so the zombies were coming back to the surface and wandering through the city. No one dared mess with those 3, because they were the only ones who had taken on the apocalypse itself, and so everyone was forced to do whatever he demanded. So he warned the rookie that the next day, when they came back for the people, he shouldn't even breathe in the man's direction. His job was to quietly pick up the girls and leave, without asking unnecessary questions. Otherwise, they could end up in serious trouble. He also said that at first glance, the man might seem polite and friendly, but in reality, he was a killer. After a while, the vehicle came to a stop. The next day, they returned to the madman's house to pick up the girls. Suddenly, they saw them outside in the freezing cold. The girls had left his house on their own. Their arms were covered in cuts and scratches, so it was clear they had fought him. They were shivering as well. It was bitterly cold outside. Meanwhile, Ju Yonak sat in his house. He had lit a fire so he wouldn't freeze. He sat by the fireplace, constantly eating and drinking. It was already his 10th can. There was no stopping him. Yonak admitted that what he made really did taste amazing. He started laughing. The world really was a strange place. Meanwhile, someone had managed to sneak onto the ship where the main character was staying. Tracks led right up to it. It seemed someone had found him, or at least noticed signs of his presence. The enemies headed straight for the place where he was hiding, the restroom. But the main character had prepared for this and set up an improvised alarm system. He had stretched ropes all along the corridor, weaving a kind of makeshift web. Anyone trying to approach him would definitely get caught in the trap and snag one of the lines. And that's exactly what happened. An enemy hand brushed a rope and immediately gave away their presence. They were zombies who had crawled out from beneath the snow and followed the scent of a human. The end of the rope was tied to a small bell, which started ringing loudly with a harsh grating sound. That noise was supposed to wake the main character, but it didn't. The guy kept sleeping, his head buried under the covers. He was wearing headphones. He liked listening to music before falling asleep. Because of that, he couldn't hear the bell and slept on. He dreamed about his past life, back before the snow and before the apocalypse. Sergeant Cheon had been a very good soldier, carrying out his duties diligently. He commanded a whole tank and carried out dangerous combat missions in it. One day, his girlfriend came to see him, something she rarely did, since he hardly had any free time. The general himself informed him and gave him permission to go on a date with her. They sat together in a small room, and the atmosphere was very tense. Suddenly, staring down at the floor, she said she wouldn't be coming to see him anymore. The words hit him hard. He still loved her deeply and hadn't expected to hear that. He couldn't understand what she meant. Was she really going to leave him? But she didn't answer. She just sat there in silence, unable to speak. After a while, she realized there was no point staying silent and began to explain. She said she no longer had the strength to keep waiting for his return, since she had no idea when it would all be over. In the end, she just couldn't endure it anymore and asked him to forgive her. He looked at her, listened carefully, and then started to smile. He tried to reassure her, saying his job was actually the safest. He was a tanker, protected by layers of armor. But that wasn't what she wanted to hear. In truth, he had already understood where this was going and knew it would end this way. They had to make that decision and go on living, but no longer together. That was the end. They went their separate ways. Still, he wanted their relationship to end on a good note. She stood up and thanked him for the time they had spent together. He smiled, but couldn't even bring himself to look her in the eyes. As she was leaving, she suddenly stopped, remembering something. She asked him to do one last thing for her. Smiling, she said she wanted to touch his head. She'd never seen him bald before. He chuckled, but he didn't really have a choice. So he let her touch his head. She placed her hand on his head and gently stroked it. The sensation was very strange and new to her, and he almost burst into tears. Nothing more heartbreaking had ever happened to him. Then she took her hand away, and he realized that was the last thing he would ever feel from her. At that very moment in the present, he was asleep, and a zombie's hand was reaching toward his head. Suddenly, he sensed something and realized he was in danger. He opened his eyes as the bell rang and saw a horde of mutants in front of him, reaching out to grab him. But he managed to jump up right as the monster's hand slammed down on the pillow. He bolted, and his backup plan worked, giving him a chance to escape. The main character rushed to the exit he had prepared for himself earlier. He was lucky because the tunnel was full of cables that slowed down the monsters chasing him. There were so many of them that they were pushing each other, yet they still forced their way through the ruins of the ship. He pulled a huge concrete slab over the passage behind him and hoped it would hold them back for at least a while. There was nowhere else to go, so he pressed himself against the wall and just waited. There was a deep chasm between him and the zombies, but he didn't know if it would really help. He couldn't understand how this had happened. He had checked everything in detail. But now he was in serious danger. He had very few bullets left, and the zombies kept chasing him. He kept his finger on the trigger, ready to fire. Despite the gap separating him from the mutants, they still managed to reach his side. They simply climbed over it, jumping onto the slab where he was sitting. On top of that, the concrete slab he had used to block the passage was starting to give way. New cracks appeared in it, and through them he could see the mutants' heads. They kept pushing, and gradually the slab began to break apart into pieces. He held them at gunpoint, but knew that if they all burst through at once, he would have no chance of stopping them. Suddenly, he heard a terrible crash and realized that the restroom barrier couldn't withstand the pressure. It started to collapse, and all the zombies fell down. He realized how lucky he was. That was what had just saved his life. The room was filled with thick dust, and he couldn't see anything. Cheon had already said goodbye to life, but this gave him new hope. Very carefully, very slowly, he looked down to make sure the danger had passed and nothing threatened him anymore. But when he saw what was really happening, he almost fainted from fear. The mutants had survived the fall and were still climbing up, trying to reach him. Even the height and the concrete blocks that had smashed onto their heads didn't stop them. They kept moving toward him. Cheon realized he couldn't just stand there. He had to think. Very soon, he saw the first mutant manage to reach his platform. The zombie was only a few meters away from him, and it was clear that the others would follow. Suddenly, he had an idea. He thought about the ventilation shaft, though it was dangerous. There could be zombies near the outlet as well. But if he got lucky and there were none, he could reach another room. So without hesitating, he rushed toward it. It was his only chance to survive, even though he had no idea what was waiting for him next. He simply jumped over the zombies who raised their hands trying to grab him. Cheon dove into the ventilation opening. The mutants kept pursuing him, so he knew he couldn't slow down. He hoped he would survive and wouldn't give up. He noticed that most of the room had already collapsed, but he could feel the zombies behind him and hear their growling in the dark. There was no way back, so he rushed forward despite the dangerous ruins. He tried to climb down as fast as possible and even fell several times. It was night outside and he could barely see anything, moving almost blindly. He just hoped to reach an exit. After some time, he managed it. He jumped out through a window and ended up outside. Behind him, in that same window, he could see the zombies. He heard a terrible roar and realized that the building had collapsed. But he knew killing those mutants wasn't that easy, so they might still be alive. He kept them in his sights, bracing for the worst. Suddenly, he felt something touch his arm and squeeze tightly. Looking down, he saw a mutant's hand grabbing his leg and sticking out of the ice. The snow had melted, and beneath the ice there was a huge number of zombies trying to reach the surface. They had managed to crack the ice. And he was standing right above them, not understanding how he could possibly save his life. He'd never imagined there could be so many mutants. And at that moment, he started to panic, realizing that any sudden movement could break the ice, and then he definitely wouldn't be able to escape. In that moment, he remembered the private who had died right in front of him, and he had done nothing to save him. The hand kept gripping his leg, and he couldn't do anything. He was frozen with fear. Suddenly, he realized the zombie looked very familiar. Staring into its face, he understood everything. It was his friend. Ironically, now he had become a mutant and was trying to tear him apart. The main character tried to pull free, but the mutant had almost completely crawled out from under the snow. It grabbed him higher, this time catching Cheon by the arm and refusing to let go. Its jaw was torn, slime dripping from it, and the hungry zombie was growling just centimeters from his face. It felt as if he was asking why Cheon abandoned him back then and did nothing to help. Cheon had just stood there, watching the monsters rip him apart, and now it seemed the zombie wanted Cheon to feel the same pain. Suddenly, just as the main character was ready to die, he heard a voice urging him to pull himself together. In reality, he had imagined it. All the zombies were still under the ice. They weren't a threat unless the ice cracked. He couldn't believe he actually heard a living person's voice. Turning around, he saw a man in a red jacket behind him, and had no idea how he approached so silently. The man explained that he only needed to fear zombies with red eyes. The rest were harmless and easy to kill. The man spent his time chopping off zombie hands and heads before the ice could melt completely. The boy started apologizing for forcing him to intervene, but the man asked him not to. He was just doing his job. He killed any mutants that reached the surface to prevent them from escaping once the ice melted. Suddenly, he told Cheon that from the very beginning he seemed like a very honest, decent guy. And then he invited him to his home so he could warm up and rest. In reality, the man was Ju Yonik, and he smiled as he spoke to the main character. The criminal was already thinking about how he would cut him into pieces, while the boy stared at him in terror. Cheon tried to understand what this man wanted. His face looked very familiar. Then the man revealed his secret weapon. He had coffee, an incredible rarity in these times. And Ju Yonak was convinced Cheon couldn't refuse, especially since he had no clothing and would freeze to death otherwise. Cheon understood that perfectly. He had lost all his belongings. In fact, he had nothing left at all. He'd left everything inside the ship. The ammo, food, and gear he desperately needed to survive. Ju Yonik tried to convince him not to risk his life by returning there. He promised to give him clothes and food. Cheon agreed that returning now was impossible anyway. The place was too dangerous. He could still hear the growling of the mutants trapped inside. And the building was collapsing. He didn't even know whether his things had survived. Still, he decided not to tell the man that he had a rifle and ammo inside. He didn't trust him. Even the offer sounded suspicious. No one shared food or coffee during times like these. He knew that zombies and strangers were equally dangerous. The only person he could rely on was himself. Yet he had no other choice. He took the risk and followed the man to his house. There was no longer any doubt. This was the same stranger he had been watching for days. The man invited him to sit beside a heater. It was warm there, and he could recover faster. He even gave him his own jacket, thick and warm. Inspecting the jacket, Cheon immediately realized such clothing belonged only to military personnel. The man began asking how he had managed to survive alone in such a dangerous place full of mutants. The main character admitted he'd truly been on his own, and the criminal seemed pleased to hear that. Cheon explained that he had lost his last friend years ago and had been alone ever since. Ju Yonak tried to win his trust, calling him strong and brave. He even said he would never have dared to do what Cheon did, treating it almost like a heroic act. Then he suddenly said he understood everything. Cheon was that type of guy. Cheon didn't understand and asked what he meant. Yonak replied that the boy was annoying. He didn't listen to adults and always acted in his own way. Cheon realized his words could have offended the host, so he immediately apologized if he had behaved rudely.